what they're saying now is that we are, genetically speaking, 98% chimpanzee. We share 98% of our genetic material. So obviously we come from a common ancestor. We have the same great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. At some point, chimpanzees and so on split. Now, I've been wondering, what does it mean when somebody says, I'm 98% chimpanzee? Exactly how much do I have in common? How am I supposed to sort this out? And furthermore, you know what? I have an awful time explaining it. I just can't explain it all. And so I've invited my good friend, Dr. Timothy Standish, here onto the program. He's going to help me explain all of this and understand how it is I'm 98% chimpanzee.
Well, thanks so much for having me here. It's a privilege. You know, I think the first thing that you've got to understand, Sean, is that that number is almost meaningless, the 98%, the way that it's arrived at.
Now, Dr. Standish, to be honest, I mean, I've checked out some of my friends and so on, and I can see how they might be 98% chimpanzee. I mean, it just makes sense.
Yeah, I'll agree, you know, that certainly my mother has accused me of being somewhat more than 98% chimpanzee on occasion. But when you look at the DNA in human beings and the DNA in chimpanzees, you simply do not get 98% identical.
Well, help me understand, because my Time magazine says I'm 98% chimpanzee.
Yes, but you see, my science magazine, actually Nature, which came out a couple of years ago, where they actually compared these two genomes, said 96%.
96. So
96.
They're not even really agreed on the number yet.
No, they're not. And there's a very good reason for that. It's very difficult to compare two different things in the way that it's done and actually come up with a realistic number. You can think of it like this. If you took two books, let's say the Bible and The Origin of Species.
Bible and Darwin.
Yes. And you just looked at the letters that we used there. Well, there's A, B, C, D, E, the alphabet and some punctuation and so on. In fact, if you just looked at those letters, you would say exactly the same letters are used in the Bible and exactly the same letters are used in The Origin of Species. Therefore, they're 100% identical.
Is that what they're doing when they're saying I'm 98% chimpanzee?
Not quite. However, with the 98% number, what they're doing is they're actually taking genomes and they're removing a whole bunch, which we won't worry about.
And a genome is
the DNA, all of the DNA that's found in a human being and all of the DNA that's found in a chimpanzee.
Okay.
And they remove a whole bunch, and then they compare what's left.
Oh, so this isn't based on the whole package?
The 98% number is not based on the entire package, even though it's spoken of as if it is a meaningful number.
So they actually have to take stuff away to start working on this and come to 98?
Yes.
Okay.
You could use what was done, this was some years ago, as a textbook example of how to lie with statistics, frankly. Because, and there are many other numbers. Some 99.4% is another published number. 95% is another published number in prestigious scientific journals. I think there's one that's 98.77. That really sounds precise.
It's like ivory soap.
Yes, yes. And obviously all of these numbers can't be correct. And they are arrived at by comparing in different ways. Even if they were correct, and think about this, there are 3 billion letters in the genetic code that codes for you.
3 billion bits of information?
3 billion, yes. You can think of them as letters in there, except they're DNA letters, okay?
Right.
3 billion of them. Actually, you got 3 billion from your mother and 3 billion from your father. And that's an awful lot. If you were to put them all together, they'd be about as tall as you are, about 2 meters in length. From every single cell in your body. Now, 2% difference is a lot. 2% is 60 million differences between you and a chimpanzee, if 98% was actually correct.
So they're trying to make it sound like we're virtually identical, except for maybe a little extra hair and that kind of thing.
Precisely.
But that 2% represents an awful lot. How much did you say?
About 60 million.
60 million bits of information in that 2%, and that's after they already removed some of the information.
That's right.
Amazing.
So even if you took it as being actually correct, it clearly isn't. Let me give you one other number that sort of illustrates why these numbers are fairly meaningless. The chimpanzee genome is actually larger than the human being genome.
They actually have more information.
Well, they've got more DNA.
More DNA.
Yes, about 6 to 7% more, depending on which estimates you look at. So it's pretty hard to get 98% identical out of something that's 6 or 7% bigger.
Right. So
And there are these differences. They're not just sort of spread at random throughout these genomes. They're concentrated in specific places. So, for example, genes that are thought to have something to do with intelligence,
right,
they are more different in human beings than they are in chimpanzees.
So the differences that are there are significant differences.
Yes, obviously.
Yeah.
Look at a chimpanzee and look at you.
Well, I'd hate to draw that comparison. You're tempting my mother-in-law this evening, but I hear what you're saying. I mean, I think about this, and they marvel. You know, they say a chimpanzee has a vocabulary of 200 words. It can't speak them, but it can recognize 200 symbols, and we think, wow, but you know, my 2-year-old had thousands of words.
And obviously, there are huge differences. I mean, just look at a chimpanzee. Obviously, there are huge differences between a chimpanzee and, let's say, my wife. Mm-hmm. Okay. Me, I won't say. My wife, I will. I'm safe there. But just because there are similarities doesn't mean that you're looking at the same thing. You also need to take into consideration those differences in the DNA, but also DNA in the bodies, differences in the anatomy of a chimpanzee and a human being, or a gorilla and a human being. Obviously, there are huge differences. It's not just intelligence. Numerous differences.
So that's 60 million bits of information. That's just a lot of difference. It's a very. I'm sure I read somewhere they put a computer in the chimpanzee cage a while back to see what the chimpanzees would do with it. Have you read about this?
It was some kind of monkey. I don't remember whether it was chimpanzees.
Oh, you know, we have 98% in common. What will they do with this Macintosh?
Will they type Shakespeare?
Will they type Shakespeare? And basically, they threw their food at it and hit it with a rock.
Yeah. As I recall it, they typed a lot of S's.
That's right, one after the other.
They liked S, the letter S.
That's the 2%. Right, they're not building cities, they're not driving cars, they haven't built an airplane, they haven't done any of the things that human beings have done, and that 2% is just that massive of a difference.
Except that it's not really 2%.
Right, of course.
It's figuring out a realistic number for comparing two things like this is probably not possible to do.
Okay, so that kind of solves that mystery.
Well, except for one thing. Let me interrupt you.
Yeah.
Obviously, chimpanzees are more like us than, let's say, snails.
Yeah,
and,
okay. Well, no, I have a relative that would probably...
Yes, on a sort of scale of things. They are more like us than snails.
Yes.
And so it shouldn't be surprising to find out that their DNA is more like ours than a snail's or an oak tree or something like that. Obviously, that is what we would expect.
So we would actually have DNA in common with any living thing.
Yes.
And